Okay. Well, welcome everybody to our Ocean Health Speaker Series. Really glad that you can join us this evening. Tonight we have Kelsey Gill, and I'll introduce her in a moment. But I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. So specifically the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people, and we're grateful to be on this land. I want to thank our sponsors for our Ocean Health Speaker Series. So this is a monthly speaker series if this is the first time you're joining us. And we have a whole variety of different speakers, so I hope that you'll join us again in future months. Next week we have Lauren Cruz, who's going to be speaking about aquaculture and the future of food, whether it, and the concept of seaweed and shellfish being an increasingly important part of our food source potentially in the future. Our sponsors are the North Shore News, the West Vancouver Foundation, and the Holly Burn Sailing Club. So we really want to thank you and allowing us to make this possible. Thank you. We really encourage questions tonight. So Kelsey's going to have about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation tonight to answer questions. So if you have questions, we'd ask that you put them in the chat at the bottom of your screen. If you type in your questions, then we'll be collecting them. We have Chantal Hancock, who's our program coordinator with us. She'll be collecting the questions and she'll be posing your questions on your behalf to Kelsey. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kelsey Gill. So Kelsey is a PhD candidate. She studies internal anatomy and the biomechanics of whales at UBC. And she's about to do her doctoral defense on June 21st, at which time she'll become Dr. Kelsey Gill. She'll have her PhD in marine biology, so super exciting. And Kelsey has a special connection to Ocean Ambassadors. She works with our youth on the beach, exploring the intertidal zone and sharing her research with young people. And I think in very sort of the coolest thing about Kelsey is that she is just so great with young people and inspiring kids to think about careers around the ocean. So I think kids can really see themselves in her, this vibrant young woman. And we actually have quite a few young ocean ambassadors joining us tonight who know Kelsey. So that's kind of fun. So to you guys that are here, welcome and enjoy. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Kelsey. Welcome.
Thank you. All right, let me get my screen set up here. All right. So thank you guys all for coming to this talk. I'm pretty excited to give a fun talk before my slightly more stressful thesis defense talk in 12 days. So I have spent the past 6.5 years studying the internal anatomy and biomechanics of whales. And whales are fascinating to me because of their terrestrial ancestry. So whales descended from four-legged hoofed mammals that lived on land, and then starting about 50 million years ago, they began this transition back to an aquatic lifestyle. So this meant adapting all of their body systems that were built for life on land to be better suited to live underwater. So these images are all fossil specimens and relatives of modern cetaceans, but it's not meant to show any sort of stepwise evolutionary progression. But what you can see from these relatives is a general shift to a streamlined body shape with a loss of hind limbs, front limbs that are now modified into flippers, a tail for propulsion, a dorsal fin for stability, loss of fur and hair, and instead blubber for thermoregulation and buoyancy. And then there are large changes to the neck and to the skull, including the nasal cavities shifting up to the top of the head to form the blowholes. And this is all just the stuff that's visible from the outside. There's still all of the internal body systems that have evolved to suit an aquatic lifestyle where everything happens underwater on a breath hold. The modern cetaceans that we're left with today are broadly categorized into two groups. We have the toothed whales and the baleen whales. The toothed whales are named for the presence of teeth, and they include all dolphins, porpoises, and a few of the larger species like beaked whales, sperm whales, and orcas. They feed on fish, squid, and marine mammals, and they're generally swallowing these items whole, or in the case of orcas and marine mammals, in very large chunks. Toothed whales are generally smaller than baleen whales. They're faster moving, and they exhibit a lot more group behavior. They also echolocate and produce sounds with air sacs in their head, which is something that baleen whales don't do, as baleen whales have a very different cranial anatomy, and they don't actually have air sacs in their heads. Baleen whales also don't have teeth, and instead they have baleen plates that hang from their upper jaw, and they use these baleen plates for bulk filter feeding, where large amounts of prey-filled water are brought into the mouth, and then the water is filtered out through the baleen plates, and the prey is trapped in the mouth. Baleen whales feed on massive quantities of zooplankton, things like krill or copepods, and sometimes small schooling fish. There are a few different methods for how these baleen whales capture their food, and baleen whales are subdivided into 3 groups based on these different feeding modes. We have the balanids, which include the right and bowhead whales, and they're the skim feeders. So they open their mouths and continuously swim slowly forward through patches of zooplankton. The tongue is really stiff and muscular, like ours, and it directs water and prey along that inner edge of the baleen, where the prey gets trapped on the baleen and the water exits the mouth through the baleen plates and through behind the baleen racks. The gray whale is the only living member in its group, the Escherichtiids, and they feed through benthic suction feeding, where a whale will do a relatively shallow dive to the sandy ocean bottom, turn on its side, open its mouth, and rapidly pull its tongue back into its mouth to generate suction. And this pulls in a bunch of sediment and tiny bottom-dwelling crustaceans. So gray whale baleen plates tend to be a lot stiffer to account for all of the sediment scrubbing against the plates and wearing them down. The last group are the rorquals, and they include the blue, fin, minke, humpback, sei, broodies, and any whale I haven't said yet. They engage in lunge feeding, which has been described as the largest biomechanical action on the planet, and it's really not surprising why. The largest rorquals are at least 70,000 kilograms, and to feed, they accelerate forward to a speed of 3 meters per second, open their mouth, and engulf a volume of prey that can be larger than their own body. And that's possible because of this intramuscular throat pouch here that extends all the way down to the belly button. Once they have that prey-filled water in their mouth and throat pouch, they have to filter all of the water out through those baleen plates and keep the prey in. And this all happens relatively quickly. So the actual engulfment part only takes a few seconds. So you'll see here, this whale is opening its mouth and engulfing a huge volume of water. The longer stage that happens afterwards is then the filtering, pushing that water out and focusing the prey in the mouth. So the whale has slowed right down after it's lunged with all that drag from opening its mouth and then swimming with that bloated tadpole shape. What's really incredible that I haven't yet mentioned about that throat pouch and engulfment is the tongue. Instead of having a rigid muscular tongue like us or like the other baleen whales, rorquals have this floppy, fatty, stretchy tongue with almost no muscle in it. So the tongue inverts and lines that throat pouch and gets stretched inward all the way down to the belly button as that pouch is filled with water. And this video demonstrates it really well. So this is a supergroup of humpback whales off the coast of South Africa. And you can see how incredibly dense the krill is there, all of that stuff in the water. So it's really no wonder that these humpbacks were gathering there. So we're gonna see that tongue in action right there, where all of the water is just forcing that tongue inward and filling up that pouch. I think that's really cool. So I kind of want to show that part again. Okay, so these humpbacks are looking kind of lazy with how they're lunge feeding, but lunge feeding is actually the most energetic feeding style among whales. These whales are holding their breath, diving down to a patch of krill, which is the same thing as exercising while holding their breath, and then using even more energy to speed up and lunge for that krill. And then they repeat this multiple times during a dive. We're very familiar with the diving patterns of these whales because we can tag them, and the tagging technology keeps getting better. These tags are harmless, they're attached with suction cups, and you can see it's kind of just like the whales getting a little pat on the back to put the tag on. So with these tags, we're able to keep track of every aspect of a whale's dive. There are accelerometers, pressure gauges, cameras, and with all that technology, we can recreate what's happening underwater during a dive. So this is a humpback whale feeding on anchovies. The video on the left side is looking towards the head, and on the right side is looking towards the tail. And all of this stuff down here is the data that's collected from that tag. So with the camera view and all of that tag data, you can sync up all of the events that are happening on a dive. This whale's heading to the surface. You can see all the birds and sea lions feeding on those anchovies as well. Hopefully not getting engulfed by the whale. So same thing here, humpback whale feeding on fish. Again, it's moving up to the surface. You can see all of the other life there feeding on the fish as well. And then this whale moves slowly up and eventually bumps into the whale above it. So kind of clumsy. So this tag data has been recorded for many different types of rorquals. So we're aware of species differences during dives, and there are some consistent differences in the foraging dive profiles among rorquals, where generally the larger species lunge fewer times per dive compared to the smaller species. This is a foraging dive for a blue whale. So it dives down to about 260 meters, lunges 3 times through this really dense patch of krill that's in red, and then it comes back up to the surface and rests for a bit. Fin whales are slightly smaller and they lunge about 4 times per dive. Now, holding your breath and exercising and feeding, and especially feeding in the most energetically expensive way among whales, means that these rorquals are incredibly time limited on their dives. So things have to happen really fast underwater. The average amount of time between those lunges at depth for a fin whale is about 30 seconds. During that 30 seconds, they've engulfed a volume of water that can be larger than their own body. They've filtered out that water, and then they've swallowed their prey so that they're ready to lunge again. Now, 30 seconds seems like an incredibly short amount of time to filter out that much water and then swallow the food. If we think about our own feeding patterns, an average peristalsis speed, or rate of food transfer down the esophagus, is somewhere around 1 to 2 centimeters per second. And for an average esophagus length of about 20 centimeters in humans, it takes us about 10 seconds to swallow a single bolus, during which time it's pretty hard to initiate another swallow. I'm sure you've all been in a situation where you're incredibly hungry and you're just shoving food in your face as fast as you can, and you start coughing and choking because your body really doesn't want you to eat that fast. So how are rorquals eating that fast? And honestly, it gets more confusing when you look at how incredibly small the esophagus is. For a 19-meter long fin whale, the overall width of the esophagus here is really only about 10 centimeters along that outer edge. And then the lumen, this hollow part on the inside where food travels through, is closer to only about 8 centimeters at its widest point. The esophagus is incredibly muscular. It's also pretty stiff. I've tried to shove my hand and arm into the esophagus, and it's actually quite a challenge. So if you bring your hands together and make a circle with your thumbs and middle fingers touching one another, that's about how big the esophagus of one of the largest animals on the planet is. And when we look at that relationship between esophagus size and body size, the esophagus, and especially that hollow lumen, is much smaller than you would expect based on the size of the whale. So this is a harbor porpoise esophagus here. It's much less muscular, it's pretty floppy, and it's pretty wide. There's also some differences that we can look at between fin whales and this harbor porpoise here in terms of tissue composition. So I expected to see differences between the toothed whale and the rorqual whale esophagus, being that toothed whales are swallowing large whole prey. So maybe they need a larger, stretchier esophagus, whereas rorquals are swallowing a slurry or fluid-like volume of krill. Well, this small, stiff, muscular esophagus of rorquals is clearly working well for them to have become some of the largest animals ever to have lived. So we looked more at the anatomy, we performed some mechanical tests on the esophagus, and we threw some math at this problem to try to figure out how the anatomy and mechanics of this fin whale esophagus contributes to its function. We inflated a fin whale esophagus with water to calculate the capacity and measured the pressure inside the esophagus during inflation. So this is before, and this is once it's inflated, and there's not a huge difference in the diameter here or the length. We then cut the esophagus into segments, and we did stretch tests where we measured the maximum stretch and the corresponding force required to stretch it. We took samples of the tissue along the esophagus and we processed them for microscopy. Once we gathered all this data about the esophagus, we matched it up to the engulfment volumes of fin whales, which range from 30 to 70 meters cubed. And we combined that with krill densities measured in the ocean, which vary quite a lot. This allowed us to calculate how much krill a fin whale might engulf with each lunge. And that number, yet again, varies quite a lot. Based on metabolic estimates, an average fin whale needs about 1,000 kilograms of krill per day. So if a whale spent its entire day, all 24 hours dedicated solely to feeding, it would need to get 42 kilograms of krill every hour to meet its metabolic demands. That seems reasonable when you have a huge mouth, except for the small esophagus and the really short amount of time between lunges. Also, lunging is really energetically expensive. So these whales are aiming to engulf as much krill as they possibly can every time they lunge, and they could very well end up with more krill than they could fit down that 20-liter esophagus at one time. If that's the case, they might need to do multiple swallows to get all of the food down. But if we go back to our human peristalsis rate of only 1 to 2 centimeters per second, down a fin whale esophagus that's 2 meters long, it's going to take way more than that 30 seconds in between lunges to swallow everything. So to put this all together, we considered some other ideas for what could be happening, and we looked north of the esophagus towards the mouth and the pharynx, and that pharynx is the region between the mouth and esophagus. And we looked south of the pharynx to the stomach to see what the capacity of the stomach was, and how the stomach filling up played into patterns of whale feeding observations that had been made by other researchers. And in order to actually answer this question, we had to ask and answer another question, which is what is happening in the pharynx, that region between the mouth and esophagus, when fin whales are trying to swallow their food? How are their lower and upper respiratory tracts protected from food that is very small and very much still alive and squirming around? If we think about ourselves, we can't eat and breathe simultaneously due to the anatomy of our throat. The respiratory and digestive tracts leading from the nasal cavity and the oral cavity come together at the back of the throat in this region called the pharynx. The pharynx is a really muscular region, and it can be subdivided into 3 regions. The nasopharynx, behind the nasal cavities here, is only used by the respiratory tract. The oropharynx, which is behind the mouth, is used by both respiratory and digestive tracts. And the laryngopharynx down here is really just used by the digestive tract. The human arrangement of the throat isn't standard among mammals. Humans have a descended larynx, which provides a nice resonating area for sound production. So with our descended larynx, that places this really big gap between the upper respiratory tract, or the nasal cavities, and the lower respiratory tract down here where the larynx is. So we have favored the ability to speak in exchange for this risk of choking. The larynx is what's responsible for preventing choking. During breathing, the esophagus is collapsed and air can be directed from the nasal cavities right down into the open larynx. During swallowing, however, the epiglottis, this big broad leaf-shaped cartilage, folds down and makes contact with these corniculate and arytenoid cartilages to close the opening to the larynx. So most mammals, unlike humans, have a larynx that's really high in the neck so that the soft palate overlaps with the epiglottis. So in herbivores, they maintain overlap between the epiglottis and the soft palate while they're feeding so that they can simultaneously smell for predators. So both the respiratory tract and digestive tract remain connected and usable at all times. Carnivores break contact between the epiglottis and soft palate during swallowing to accommodate large chunks of meat passing through the pharynx. So on the diagram here, the soft palate is in blue, the epiglottis is in red, and during breathing, the epiglottis is making contact with the soft palate so that air can go from the nasal cavities down into the larynx and trachea. And then during swallowing, the epiglottis closes over top of the larynx so that food can be directed from the oral cavity into the esophagus. And then you have the toothed whales, which have the most extremely modified larynx of any animal. So the epiglottis and the corniculates, E and C here, are elongated into a tube called the laryngeal spout. And this is permanently inserted up in the nasopharynx. And it's held in place there by a sphincteric muscle of the soft palate. So the opening to the larynx is completely enclosed in the nasopharynx, up in the upper respiratory tract. So the respiratory tract is completely separate from the digestive tract, and there's no risk of choking by getting food in your respiratory tract or having food go down the wrong pipe like we sometimes do. Food just travels around either side of this spout and onto the esophagus. So this allows toothed whales to echolocate at all times, as there's always contact between lower and upper respiratory tracts, and air can travel from the lungs into the air sacs in the head. Toothed whales need to be able to echolocate at all times because that's how they navigate and find food. So if you open up the mouth of a dolphin really wide, you can actually see the laryngeal spout way in the back of the pharynx. And this laryngeal spout seems like a really great idea because they're completely eliminating the risk of choking by getting food in their respiratory tract. Unfortunately, there are still asphyxia-related incidents in toothed whales. So this is your heads up that the next slide has some images of dead dolphins during necropsies, and there's a little bit of blood involved. Toothed whales can asphyxiate if the prey that they're swallowing dislodges that laryngeal spout from its position in the upper respiratory tract. Dislodging the laryngeal spout breaks the connection between lower and upper respiratory tracts, and then these dolphins can't breathe. This can be the result of a dolphin or porpoise attempting to eat a fish that's just a little bit too large and it pushes that laryngeal spout right out of the way, or attempting to eat something like an octopus that really doesn't want to be eaten, or a porcupine fish that also doesn't want to be eaten and inflates in the throat. So you can see the dislodged laryngeal spout in some of these images here. And researchers still aren't actually sure if dolphins can pop that laryngeal spout back into place if they manage to move this prey out of the way, because the only evidence we ever see are the ones that clearly cannot get that back into place. Interestingly, in this paper about the bottlenose choking on sheep's head here, there were other fish species involved that dolphins choked on, but there was also fishing gear involved in 5 out of those 14 instances of asphyxia, with fishing lures and lines attached to the fish or embedded in the dolphin's stomach or esophagus. So human impact is unfortunately the result of some of these cases. And in other cases, there's just some really unlucky dolphins and porpoises that tried to swallow fish that they probably shouldn't have. And I will add that this is actually a very small subsample of images that I could have shown you, because asphyxia happens a lot in toothed whales, surprisingly enough. With the issue of asphyxia, despite such extreme laryngeal modifications in toothed whales, we questioned how the respiratory tract is protected in rorquals, especially since they feed in such a different manner and their prey is very different. From what we'd seen from other researchers, it didn't appear that the rorqual larynx over here looked anything like the toothed whale larynx. Despite this, some of the work from other researchers suggested that baleen whales must have a larynx that functions in the same way as this toothed whale larynx. And there's this problem in whale research where dolphins are really familiar to us because they're everywhere, in the wild and in captivity, and they're smaller, so they're a lot easier to handle. So a lot of our knowledge about dolphins gets transferred over to whales, and people assume that baleen whales look the same on the inside or that they function in the same way, when really there's 23 million years of evolution between toothed whales and baleen whales, and both groups have really diverged. The toothed whales are generally small, fast, and social, and they're always producing sounds to interact with their environment. Baleen whales went a different way, with their bulk filter feeding and becoming massive in size. Based on this, it made sense to us that the larynx should be adapted to protect the respiratory tract during feeding. The primary role of the larynx in all mammals is to act as a valve to protect the lower respiratory tract. And since rorquals don't need a permanently connected respiratory tract to echolocate like the toothed whales do, we didn't expect to see any anatomy that demonstrated that. And we didn't. We manipulated the cartilages that form the larynx, and we pushed the epiglottis above and below the soft palate, kind of making it do the same actions that a carnivore larynx would. We looked at the interaction of all the structures, and since we managed to keep the pharynx intact during this dissection, it was really awesome. We put together a model for the position of everything during breathing and then during swallowing. And what we decided from all of that work was that the larynx acts surprisingly similar to that of a carnivore or human, where the opening to the larynx must be sealed to prevent any of that living prey from actually getting into the lower respiratory tract. And the upper respiratory tract, the nasopharynx and the nasal cavities, are protected by the massive amount of muscle that composes the nasopharynx, just blocking those upper airways. So with the upper and lower respiratory tracts completely sealed up and protected from food, we can go back to thinking about food transfer from the mouth to the stomach. And the pharynx ends up being really important for swallowing, as the pharynx can act as a funnel and also a muscular pump to push all of the krill that fin whales engulf down the esophagus and to the stomach. So none of the research that I've talked about so far has been published. So I apologize for being a little bit cryptic about everything and not showing you more data and more pictures of the actual gory details. But the plan is to defend my thesis and then get these papers out as soon as possible. So hopefully they'll be accessible to everyone soon. I know that a lot of these questions we've been asking about the internal anatomy and mechanics of rorquals swallowing their food seem incredibly straightforward. Yet it amazes me that nobody has researched these questions before. And I really can't blame anyone because whales are really big and really challenging to work with, especially when you're looking at internal anatomy and trying to get tissue that isn't totally degraded. You have to rely on necropsies, which are a rewarding experience in themselves to determine how the whale died, but they're very hit or miss on whether or not you have the ability to actually get inside a whale that weighs tons and whether or not that whale is really decomposed or has tissue that's useful. So for necropsies, there's usually a small group of people on a beach or a boat launch, and you do your best with your own strength to try to examine and disassemble that whale. Other times you're a little bit luckier and there's a crane nearby or a shipyard, and you can actually get people to help you move that whale so that you have better access to do a full necropsy and maybe take a peek inside the whale and gather some tissue for your thesis. This idea of there being so much that we still don't know is something that I've been fixated on throughout my PhD. There are so many things about animals and how they work, and it's animals of all sizes, from whales to microscopic organisms, and it's even basic stuff like swallowing food that we just don't know about. Additionally, unless you're exposed to these animals and know that these animals exist, you can't care about them, which always reminds me of that Jacques Cousteau quote that Allison brought up earlier about people protecting what they love. So my goal now is to teach people about marine life so that they know that it exists and they can care about it. And hopefully they end up loving the ocean and its animals and the environment and want to protect it. The ocean supports the whole planet. So I think it's important for everyone to care. And you don't actually have to live close to the ocean to care about it. I didn't grow up by the ocean. I grew up in northern Alberta, but I feel pretty lucky because I decided at a young age that I was going to be a marine biologist. And I don't think I even knew what that really meant at that point. But I had my orca stuffed animal and a favorite movie, and I was happy. And I had the most supportive family that got me to the ocean as much as possible. In grade 6, I saw the ocean for the first time in Tofino, and I was totally enamored with all of these intertidal invertebrates. I had no idea what anything was, but I had a great time exploring and looking around and poking jelly-like animals. I was obsessed with finding sand dollars. I saw this really big jellyfish that I now know was a lion's mane jelly that had washed up on the beach, and I was amazed by how big it was and how really truly jelly-like it was. Then I got to do some more of that same stuff during my undergrad, though it was a little bit more structured, at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center. And this time I learned about what I was poking, and I was still completely enamored with all of it. There were these things that I didn't even recognize as animals. I figured they were just moldy, crusty bits of something, but instead they were tiny anemone-like creatures called bryozoans living in this hard exoskeleton, or rocks that were moving because they weren't actually rocks at all, they were barnacles, or that anemones seem like these delicate little flowers, but sometimes they fight one another. I learned that there's a nudibranch called Melody, the hooded nudibranch that smells like watermelon. Meanwhile, there's a sea star that smells like garlic. Brittle stars have light sensing parts on their skeletons that I ended up doing my honors thesis on. I learned all sorts of animals are capable of regeneration, like sea stars and crabs, but perhaps the most spectacular example is that you can push a sea sponge through a cheesecloth until it's just a bunch of cells, and then those cells will all come together again over the span of a few days to reform a sponge. There's just so much cool stuff out there. And after spending almost 11 years in university doing an undergrad and now a PhD, I feel like it's my responsibility to share this knowledge that I've been so lucky to access and to show people what's out there. And hopefully by knowing what's out there, people will want to work towards saving it. For example, I recently learned that a friend of mine didn't know that anemones were animals. He thought they were just plant-like organisms. But now, knowing that they're animals, my friend actually cares about the well-being of anemones. So all of these animals, big and small, with or without backbones, they all play an integral role in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial ecosystems. And humans are impacting all of these ecosystems. So I think we need to focus on awareness and showing younger generations what's out there and provide them with the knowledge and tools to protect the environment. And that's why I'm so grateful to be a part of Ocean Ambassadors and take part in all of these school and summer camps and inspire these kids to do big things. So thank you to Ocean Ambassadors for existing, for hosting this speaker series, and thank you all for listening to my talk. Ooh.
Thank you, Kelsey. And
Stop sharing.
Chantel will pose the questions. And if you have questions that you'd like asked, now's a great time to pop them into the chat.
Yes, thank you so much, Kelsey. I'm always in awe of just how much of a wealth of knowledge you are. So we have a couple questions here already. So the first one is, how many types of whales are there and what is the largest whale?
Okay, so the largest whale is the blue whale. There's about a dozen baleen whale species, and then there's closer to 100 toothed whale species. They're quite diverse.
It's a lot of whales. And then another question that kind of pertains to like your dissections of the whales. So what happens to the remains of the whale after the examination?
Yeah, okay, that's actually a really good question. A lot of the time they are towed back out to the ocean so that they can just go back into the environment. And, you know, you might have heard of like whale falls where dead whales are on the bottom and all these other organisms come and start feeding on them and living on them. So generally we're aiming for that, unless there's some sort of odd, weird toxin or disease that the whale was suffering from.
All right, another question we have here is, what university did you go to?
Yeah, so I went to the University of Alberta for my undergrad, and then I did like 8 months worth of courses out at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And then for my PhD, I've been at UBC.
Been all over the place.
Yeah.
Let's see here. What is another question? So how big can a whale get and how many whales are there in the world?
Oh, I have no idea what the answer to that last question is. Probably not as many as there should be. So the biggest whale, I believe the biggest record of a whale was 33 meters for a blue whale. And Matt, maybe you guys have seen that article that came out today about bowhead whales progressively getting smaller since the 80s. I feel like there might be a similar thing happening to some of the other baleen whales like blue whales, because a lot of these records we have of these incredibly large animals that are like 33 meters long are older. And I think now the average size for a blue whale that we're seeing is probably closer to 27 meters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
We have another question here. Sophia would like to know how many teeth whales lose and how often.
Oh my gosh. So I don't actually think that toothed whales lose their teeth at all. Yeah, so generally mammals have like a set of baby teeth when they're suckling, and then they have better, stronger adult teeth. So they lose the baby teeth and then have adult teeth. Now I need to look this up, figure this out before my thesis defense.
Never ending questions.
Yeah. Really good questions though.
So other than being a marine biologist, was there any other sort of jobs that you would have considered kind of in the same route?
No, honestly. I think I decided, my parents are here, they can confirm. I was like 2 or 3 years old. I think I couldn't even say the word properly, but I decided I was going to be a marine biologist, and that's all it's ever been. I've just been on this path and really loving it and continuing to love it. So
good, because you're very good at it. Okay, so we have another question here. Do we know how whales contribute to the carbon cycle and help reduce greenhouse gases?
Man, this is also a great question. I was just reading an article last night, this work that just came out, talking about how animals specifically in the ocean can act as like carbon stores and help carbon, I guess, stay in the ocean so that it doesn't end up in the atmosphere contributing to greenhouse gases. So yes, definitely. I want to find that and read more about it, because it is a really interesting idea about animals actually contributing to the carbon cycle as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
This question is about our little invertebrate friends. So there was a sea star wasting disease which resulted in the death of many sea stars. Do you know what the cause of this was?
I am not actually aware if we have all decided on what a cause was. There was a bunch of different researchers like looking into this. So there were ideas that it was a virus. There was an idea that it was like a parasitic like microorganism that was just spreading across all of them. And I don't actually know what the final assessment was. I think it ended up being a combination where just like changing ocean climates and whatnot were contributing to their poorer health, or maybe like pollution and things like that. And then this parasite got in and affected them more than it might have without other sorts of influence. Yeah. And it's still an issue. There's still all of the sunflower stars are still in really bad shape, and they're not bouncing back quite as much as the ochre sea stars were.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Peter would like to know, do you do any scuba diving as a part of your research? And if so, can you tell us a bit about your diving experience?
So unfortunately, I don't dive as part of my research, but I do dive recreationally because I really just want to be a mermaid. And I really quite enjoy looking at all of those tiny marine invertebrates that just get overlooked most of the time on the beach or like when you're diving. Everybody really likes tropical diving, and I don't blame them because it's so much easier and so nice. But putting on a dry suit here and just looking at tiny little crabs is pretty fun.
Absolutely. And we have another question here. Do you know why whales beach themselves sometimes?
I don't think anybody has a solid answer, but I think the main idea is that there's some sort of acoustic disturbance and they lose track of where they are in the environment, and they're just trying to escape whatever is causing that noise. Yeah, probably human related.
Have you researched any of the kind of issues that go along with like sonic testing and that kind of?
No, but there's a colleague that used to be in our lab that was looking at like hearing damage and ear damage in whales. So I'm also interested to see where that goes and if it's been related back to any sort of testing.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Do whales breathe in the water or do they come up from air?
Ooh, this is also a great question. So they are mammals, so they breathe with lungs and they have to come up to the surface to breathe. They don't do it very frequently, though. I think it's only like 1 to 2% of their life is actually spent at the surface breathing, and it happens in just a few seconds. They just exhale really quickly, inhale again, and then they dive. Yeah, especially like things like beaked whales that just spend hours underwater. They're hardly ever at the surface, which is why we know so little about them.
So would that explain why whales breach sometimes, or?
I personally would like to believe that whales are just breaching to have fun. I think that there's been ideas suggested where it's like they're trying to knock off like parasites like barnacles or whatnot that are growing on them. It's, also maybe just a fun social thing to do. I think it's like the humpbacks that are generally the kind of weird whales that also like to do a lot of fun things that are doing that a lot.
More along the lines of the breathing of whales, how long can a whale go between breaths?
Yeah, so this varies between all of the whale species. The longest breath hold is like 2 hours, and this whale is diving like 3 kilometers down into the ocean. So it's kind of an effective, they dive really deep for their prey, so they have to hold their breath for a really long time. And then there's other species, I think, it's a lot shorter, like less than an hour, let's say, closer to like the 20 to 30 minute range.
Wow. We've had this question a few times. What is your favorite whale?
Nice. So I'm going to go with, oh man, okay. I was going to say gray whale. I always go with gray whale because that's the first whale I ever saw when I was in Tofino. So I'm a big fan of them. I got the skeleton of one tattooed on my arm. I'll still stick with that. But the more I learn about all of these whales, the more I like some of these other ones. Humpbacks are just great.
I apologize for the dog barking, but through your education activities, what labs have you had the opportunity to work in on the West Coast?
So I guess if I go back to like Bamfield, I was working in Rich Palmer's lab where I was doing my honors thesis. So we were doing like brittle star, like movement and like photo sensing stuff. We've also like, it's hard. We've done a lot of experiments like in labs at Bamfield with other professors, but I haven't necessarily worked right in their labs. And then aside from that, I've been working in Robert Chadwick's lab at UBC for my whole PhD.
I think this might be one of like the best questions to really hit it home. What is the top thing the rest of us can do to protect whales?
Oh my gosh. Honestly, anything that you are doing to protect the ocean is going to help everything that's in it, including whales. Today at the beach, when we were working with those kids camps, we came across so much trash. I think if you just focused on like waste reduction and thinking about how much you use, that would help a lot because there's so much trash floating out there in the ocean. And I personally don't like seeing whales tangled in fishing nets. It's really sad. So yeah.
Perfect. I think that's basically all the questions other than ones about how many whales have you seen?
Ooh, I don't know if I can put a number to that. I've seen many living and many dead, unfortunately.
Oh, we got one more really good question here.
Ooh.
What advice would you give to an aspiring marine biologist?
Oh man, just honestly, don't give up. Just keep pushing for what you want to do and take every opportunity that you can. Yeah, get out there.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Chantel, for asking the questions. And I really want to thank you, Kelsey, for your presentation. Really, really informative. And we look forward to much more in the way of different programs and working together with Ocean Ambassadors. We feel really great, really lucky to have you as part of our team.
Thank you.
And I think all of us on the call would like to wish you well on June the 21st. And the next time many people see you, you'll be Dr. Gill. So very excited.
Thank you guys so much.
Yeah. If you haven't signed up for the next speaker series, please do that. We also, if you go on the Ocean Ambassadors Canada website, we have a pretty great monthly newsletter called the Ocean View. And we have great articles about the latest research, different marine mammals and plants. So if you just go on any of the pages of our website, you'll be able to sign up to our newsletter. So thank you very much to everyone. And again, thanks to Kelsey, and have a great evening. Looking forward to seeing you next month.